The film opens with footage from the squad's tour, highlighting they have 28 days left before returning to the United States. While stationed at a checkpoint, the squad hears gunshots, and a car filled with insurgents speeds past, one of whom fires at them. Reacting swiftly, King's men jump into their Humvees and pursue the insurgents into an alley. However, upon exiting their vehicles, the insurgents ambush them from rooftops. In the ensuing firefight, a rocket-propelled grenade strikes, destroying one of the Humvees and claiming the lives of 2 soldiers inside. Another RPG detonates, destroying an Iraqi vehicle. PFC Tommy Burgess narrowly escapes harm as Rico Rodriguez selflessly dives onto him, taking the brunt of the explosion and sustaining severe injuries. Moments later, squad member Paul "Preacher" Colston is tragically killed in front of Tommy, struck in the neck and jaw by enemy fire. As the chaos unfolds, Staff Sergeant King rushes into a house to aid his injured comrade, Sergeant Steve Shriver, only to discover that his actions inadvertently resulted in the deaths of several Iraqi civilians. Shocked by the unintended consequences of his actions, King grapples with the harsh realities of war as the ambush concludes with the loss of 3 soldiers. Upon their return to Texas, the soldiers were met with a warm welcome from the community, with people lining the streets holding signs and flags to greet them. Despite the outpouring of support, Brandon found himself overwhelmed by the crowd and hesitant to deliver a speech. Recognizing his friend's apprehension, Steve stepped in to offer assistance and support. After the ceremony, a senator talks to Brandon. He says he's proud and offers help. The senator wants to move Private Rodriguez to a hospital in the U.S. Brandon thanks him and says he'll call if he needs more help. That night, they attended a party and had drinks. Steve got too drunk to dance with his fiancée, so Brandon stepped in and danced with her instead. Then he started talking about what happened in the war, making people uncomfortable. Michelle called Brandon and asked him to come over. When Brandon arrived, he found Steve digging a hole in the front yard. Brandon attempted to talk to Steve, but Steve's words didn't make sense. Upon entering the house, Brandon noticed that it was a mess. When he saw a bruise on Michelle's face, Brandon realized that Steve had hit her. Steve is sleeping in the hole he dug holding a gun. Then Tommy drives over drunk after his wife has kicked him out. The next day, Brandon suggests they all go to the ranch, a small forest cabin outside of town. They spend their time drinking and watching Tommy shoot his wedding gifts, while their friend Shorty reads the cards. Steve, hungover, was sleeping in the trunk when he heard the sound of the gunshots. Startled awake, he quickly got dressed. As Shorty reached the gift for Steve and Mitchell, Steve took aim and shot at it. Later that night, Brandon confronted Steve about hitting Michelle. Steve admitted he blacked out and woke up in the trunk of Tommy's car. Brandon made it clear that such behavior couldn't happen again. The next day, Brandon, Tommy, and Steve report to their military base. Brandon, expecting to be discharged, is instead ordered back to active duty in Iraq. He goes to talk to the lieutenant colonel, expressing frustration over the unexpected order, citing the stop-loss policy and the president's declaration of the war being over. When Brandon criticizes the president, the lieutenant colonel reacts negatively, leading to a confrontation. Ultimately, the lieutenant colonel accuses Brandon of disobeying orders and being a flight risk, ordering him to the stockade. As Braden was being escorted by 2 soldiers, he fought them and escaped. He drove away, and he called Steve. Brandon tells Steve he messed up by putting down a couple of guys and going AWOL after being stop-lost back to Iraq. Steve advises Brandon to seek help from Boot. Brandon explains Boot was trying to send him to the stockade. Steve urges Brandon to calm down while he figures things out and promises to cover for him. Brandon discusses talking to the senator with his family. His father hesitates, concerned about violating the chain of command and going behind Boot, but eventually agrees. Michelle offers to drive with him. They booked a hotel for the night. While Brandon sat by the pool, he thought he saw someone and jumped to rescue them, but there was no one there. Steve called Brandon and told him he was at the jailhouse all night trying to bail Tommy out of a DUI situation. Steve expressed frustration, mentioning that Boot was about to kick Tommy out and that Brandon, as the squad leader, needed to handle the situation. Brandon told him he was on his way to D.C. to see the senator. Brandon and Michelle visit the family of Paul "Preacher" Colson, one of the soldiers under Brandon's command killed in the alley ambush. Brandon recounts the events, explaining how they came under attack at a checkpoint and pursued the attackers into an alley where they were ambushed. He admits to leading his men into the ambush, but Preacher was covering their flank. Brandon describes the intensity of the attack with RPGs, small arms, and explosions. When they returned to their car, Brandon and Michelle discovered that their car's window had been broken. Brandon told Michelle to wait for him while he went to confront the people responsible. He tracked them down into an alley and engaged in a physical fight with them. One of the men pulled out a gun, but Brandon managed to disarm him. He forced the perpetrators to their knees and prepared to shoot them. He started to shoot, but Michelle intervened, persuading Brandon to stop and leave with her. After the incident, Brandon and Michelle got a hotel room. Michelle assisted Brandon in cleaning his wounds. Later, Brandon met with another AWOL soldier who suggested a lawyer to help arrange forged discharge documents. With these documents, Brandon could establish a new identity in Canada. Brandon is laying in a bathtub when he hears the door being knocked. He saw who it was and saw it was Steve. He got in and asked what happened to his face. He told him he came to take him back. Steve informs Brandon that if he returns to the base within 14 hours, all charges will be dropped. Brandon rejects Steve's involvement, but Steve insists he's helping him. Then they found out that he got into a sniper school, and Michelle got angry asking when they would get married. He told her that they would get married after he returns from this mission, and she reminded him that he said the same thing 5 years ago. They had an argument, and she pushed him, telling him to go out. Brandon followed him outside. Steve expresses frustration over the situation about Brandon, Tommy, and Michelle. He confides in Brandon about Tommy's struggles and urges Brandon to return to duty with him. Brandon disagrees, citing the flawed nature of the war and their inability to fight it effectively. He emphasizes their identity as soldiers and Texans, rejecting the idea of returning for another tour. Brandon accuses Steve of being influenced by Boot and warns him that the senator won't help him because he's AWOL. Brandon calls the senator's office and is told that because he is now a fugitive, the senator is not interested in seeing him. Steve attempted to intervene with drunk Tommy, who claimed he was going to see his wife, but stopped at a jewelry store. When Steve tried to pull him away, Tommy mentioned something about not being able to handle his own woman, provoking Steve's anger. As Steve walked away, Tommy broke the window of the jewelry store, setting off the alarm. Brandon and Michelle visit Rico, a soldier who heroically saved Tommy from a rocket-propelled grenade during the ambush in Iraq. Rico sustained severe injuries, including blindness, the loss of his right arm and leg, and facial burns as a result of his bravery. They went out to talk and Michelle left them to have their conversation. Rico described the harrowing situation in the hospital at night, likening it to a horror movie with screams and nightmares. He expressed gratitude for being out of there in time. Brandon told him they are going to send him back. In the car, Brandon opened up to Michelle, expressing his initial motivations for joining the military and his disillusionment upon realizing the true nature of the war. He described the chaos and uncertainty of the battlefield, where everyone seemed to be armed and no one could be trusted. Brandon shared his guilt and trauma over witnessing the deaths of friends and the toll it took on his mentality. He also told her how he accidentally killed innocent Iraqi civilians. Brandon called the lawyer and told him he's in need of his services. The lawyer told him he can't talk details over the phone and hung up, instructing him to meet him with $1,000. To gather the money, they exchanged their car for a bike. With the cash in hand, they headed to meet the lawyer. They meet up with the lawyer. The lawyer told him that there is no going back after he did this. He gave him his new ID and a number who would pick him up. He took the money and left. Brandon called his mom from the house and received the news of Tommy's suicide. A proper funeral was held for Tommy, and afterwards, Brandon returned to visit Tommy's grave. There, he ended up in a dispute with Steve, during which Steve punched him, blaming him for leaving. The confrontation escalated into a physical fight, with Steve eventually breaking down in tears. They started to argue, and overwhelmed, Brandon left the scene. Brandon returned to his parents' house and said goodbye to his father. He, his mother, and Michelle then drove to the Mexican border. However, upon reaching the border, Brandon ultimately decided that he couldn't abandon everything he had ever known, and he chose not to cross into Mexico. Brandon told his mother and Michelle that if he were to go to Mexico, he would never truly be able to leave the war behind him. Upon returning, Brandon, along with Steve and other soldiers, prepared to deploy to another war. Michelle, accompanied by Brandon's parents, arrived to bid them farewell as they departed in a bus. In the bus, Brandon nudged Steve to reassure him, a silent gesture of solidarity amidst the uncertainty of war. As the bus rumbled forward, the final scene depicted a solemn yet determined group of soldiers, including Brandon and Steve, heading back to the front lines. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.